Good evening, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I'm able to welcome Stan Allen to UVA as our lecturer this evening. Stan is an architect, a scholar, and an educator. He's principal of Stan Allen Architect in New York, and he's the George Dutton Professor of Architecture at Princeton University, where he was dean of the school from 2002 to 2012, and where he currently directs the Center for Architecture, Urbanism, and Infrastructure. Stan's research and designs, which have continuously challenged and expanded the edges of architectural practice, initially gained prominence through his seminal publication, Points and Lines, Diagrams and Projects for a City, a book which included a chapter called Field Conditions. How many of you have read this? I just want to get a sense. Okay. If you haven't, write it down and read it. It's likely been one of the most read and influential texts within architectural education. Through this and other publications, including his books, Practice, Architecture, Technique, and Representation, and more recently, his two books, Landform Building, Architecture's New Terrain, and his recent book, Stan Allen, Four Projects, Stan's relocation of architecture in relation to urbanism, infrastructure, landscape, and ecology, and the rethinking of both the architectural object and the contemporary city through re-envisioning of the diagrammatic practices used to transcode information in the design process have enabled a critical evolution of these disciplines. While a principal and director of field operations from 1999 to 2003 in partnership with James Corner, important competition projects like the Downsview Park project in Toronto, and the winning entry for the Fresh Kills Reserve in New York promoted the instantiation of landscape urbanism in practice as well as in theory, while very much redirecting and revitalizing the traditional catalog of architectural, urban, and landscape strategies through new operative conceptions of program, matter, and space. Stan Allen's many significant design works include larger urban landscape projects, such as the Yanping Waterfront in Taipei, the Taichung Municipal Airport Master Plan, and the Taichung Gateway Park in Taiwan, and more detailed architectural projects, such as the new Maribor Art Gallery in Slovenia, the Bata Publishing House for the Paju Book City project in Seoul, Korea, and the Taichung Info Box in Taiwan, for which he received the National Gold Award, the Taiwan Excellence Award, and 3 AIA awards. Stan has been the recipient of many honors and awards, including the Academy Award in Architecture from the American Academy of the Arts and Letters, the President's Citation Award for exceptional contributions to architecture, and the John Haydock Award, both from the Cooper Union, which also, I would say, recognize his influence as one of the most prominent and renowned figures of architectural education of his generation. Stan was also inducted into the National Academy of Design and is also an AIA college, part of the AIA College of Fellows. Stan holds degrees from Brown University, the Cooper Union, and Princeton, and previous to his deanship of Princeton, taught at Columbia University. He's also held appointments at Harvard, the Berlage Institute, and at architectural institutions in Germany, Denmark, and Spain. Please join me in welcoming Stan Allen.
Well, thank you. How's that? Okay. Thank you for that generous introduction. We can go ahead and bring the lights down. It's about the images. It's a pleasure to be here. And scandalously, for my part, for an architect, it's actually the first time I've ever been in Charlottesville, which is also quite strange because for many years there was a very close relationship between UVA and Princeton, and we've had a lot of graduate students who were undergraduates at UVA. We hope that with Isla on board, that's going to continue. So the title of the lecture, as you can see, is Bodies of Work. I've been thinking a lot about the sort of larger trajectory of a career and how the series of projects that an architect generates over a longer period of time are related to one another? Do they form some kind of whole? Are there necessarily differences and tensions between different scales, different kinds of programs? A lot of this came out of conversations with my friend and colleague, Michael Meredith, he's the person who coined this, well, not the person who coined this phrase, but the person who proposed this idea of the body of work as a way of looking at an architect's production. My transformation of that is to make it plural, bodies of work. That I think it actually is important for an architect to work on different scales, not only because the kinds of issues that you deal with at different scales are important, but there are different time frames involved. Projects happen at different paces, and I think that variance of time frames is very useful and important for an architect. So the lecture is divided into 3 large sections, and in each one of these sections, what I want to do is to compare a recent project to some older projects, speculative design work, or theoretical work. I'm somehow hardwired to think in 3s, so I've broken this down into 3 larger sections. But I would also show 3 images to sort of situate the conversation. This is the first project that I ever realized as an architect. It's an art gallery in New York. You see works by Donald Judd, Richard Long. There's a Sol LeWitt on that wall. It's kind of hard to see. Carl Andre. And this relationship, this idea that the gallery is a kind of empty frame that is only completed when it's occupied by the artist is something that I think was very important in this early work and continues today. And I think despite the incredible jump in scale here, I think in a way you can say exactly the same thing about a large-scale urban proposition, that the job of the architect in the case of a large-scale urban proposition like this is to create a kind of framework that's going to be completed by other authors, other agents later in time. And then finally, Isla mentioned my ongoing concern with questions of drawing and representation, and that really is another continuous thread through all of this work from, this was one of the first publications I ever did, an exhibition catalog at Columbia University around 1990. So I want to go back to one of my first published speculative design works. This was published in Assemblage 10, around 1989. You can tell how old it is because it has my full name, not Stan Allen. I hadn't, it was a speculative design work and a theoretical text looking at Piranesi's Campo Marzio plan and rereading those planimetric notations to produce a different form of spatiality. I think it's important to contextualize this in the late 1980s. The Deconstructivist exhibition at Museum of Modern Art was 1986 or 7. And I think what I was looking for here was some way of engaging the problematic of disjunction and fragments that was so prominent in the ideas of deconstructivism, but tying it back to a deeper disciplinary history with this 18th century imaginative project by Piranesi. I have to admit, I was also just fascinated by some of the weird figures in the Campo Marzio plan, including this. This is an amphitheater for water games, but you see it's arranged in a spiral like a big snake. And the Piranesi plan is full of these strange things. This is the sort of first overall sketch, pulling some of those notations out. And Piranesi was one of the engravers on the Noli plan. So it is, in fact, possible to overlay the Piranesi Campo Marzio on the Noli plan, and you find very interesting points of overlap and coincidence, but then you find pieces of pure fantasy. And of course, if you go back to the publication, I was very much under the influence of Manfredo Tafuri's reading of the Campo Marzio as this moment at which the sort of Enlightenment rationality reaches that extreme of irrationality. So the idea that the supposedly rational language of classical architecture could produce all these strange figures was something that was very much in my mind at the time of this project. And again, as I was saying, very much within the kind of intellectual landscape of that particular moment in the late 1980s. Now, I show this project today for two reasons. First of all, because I recently had an occasion to pull these drawings out, and they were exhibited in an exhibition at SCI-Arc curated by Jeff Gibness and Andrew Zago. So they were sort of on my mind as I went back and pulled out these originals from now almost 30 years ago. But, excuse me, also to contextualize an exhibition we participated in about 2 years ago at the Maxi Museum in Rome at the invitation of the architecture curator Pippo Chiura. Now, the occasion for this exhibition was the Maxi Museum acquiring the archives for the original 1978 Roma Interrotta exhibition. Now, again, for the students in the audience, the piece of history here, this was an exhibition organized 1978. You can see the architects invited. And the premise of the original 1978 exhibition was that each architect would be given one of the quadrants of the Noli plan as a kind of ground to make an intervention. The proposition was that Rome, as it had developed since the 18th century, again, we're in the height of postmodernism under the influence of Colin Rowe and Michael Graves, that Rome had gone completely off the wrong track since the 18th century. You had to go back to this moment of the late 18th century to discover the kind of classical heart of Rome, which could then be the basis for these new propositions. Now, the curator, obviously understood that that was not a viable way to think about the city in the 21st century, and that Rome, like many other cities, has grown, and the periphery is more important than ever, and really needed to be the focus of this research project. And it's impossible to mention the periphery of Rome without thinking about the history. The films, for example, of Pier Paolo Pasolini in the immediate post-war period, where already this kind of in-between zone of the periphery as a zone of both social and architectural indeterminacy was really so important for these Italian post-war filmmakers. So the proposition of the exhibition in 2015 was that 25 teams of students from different schools would be invited from the United States. I think UVA participated. Am I correct? No? Somebody? I might be wrong, but and instead of looking simply at the historic center of Rome, a very large-scale territorial framework would be established, 50 kilometers by 50 kilometers. Every school got a 10-kilometer by 10-kilometer square to work on, and then they were collaged together to create a kind of new Roma Interrotta for the 21st century. Now, as it happened, Princeton came to this project quite late, and we were given the center square. But we were given the center square with the condition that we look not at the center, but at the periphery of the center. And in fact, Rome is a very compact city, and within 10 kilometers, you already go out to quite open landscape and clearly a kind of peripheral condition. So our first gesture, given this assignment, was in a sense to mark the center. In part, this was a recognition on our part of the rhetorical nature of the exhibition, that this wasn't necessarily a kind of viable urban proposition, but dedicated to an exhibition, and also operating in dialogue with the 1978 Roma Inter Rota exhibition. But our proposition was that we could create a new circuit, which in fact turns out to be almost equidistant between the Aurelian Wall, the traditional Roman wall of the city, and the GRU, or GRA, the big ring road around Rome. So, and ours would be neither a wall nor a road, but a landscaped circuit that would allow movement locally. And of course, it did function to create a center to this large assemblage of drawings. Now, if there's a sort of rhetorical gesture at this scale, we wanted to overlay other systems, an ecological scale that would work across the center. In fact, Rome is quite a green city. There's a lot of open space in Rome, and with a few decisive additions, we could create through corridors that would link right across the historic center. And then we also wanted to engage the architectural scale, and we created an array of working from Kenneth Frampton's idea of the megaform and some of the very large-scale constructions that already populate the periphery of Rome. So those were the three layers that comprise the plan. Here's a view of the circuit meeting the Appian Way. These are samples of the ways in which the circuit is developed locally. As I said, it's for biking and pedestrians. It's not an automobile circuit. And these are a mapping of a number of the conditions that we would then work with. You can see here the green that's almost continuous and needs only a few additional elements. And here is the final plan that was inserted into the exhibition. So you see the architectural fabric of the city. You see our new circuit. You see the connective tissues that run through, and then the network of these large-scale architectural interventions. Now, as I said, we were working from something that already exists in the periphery of Rome, and product mostly of the 60s and 70s, and in many ways seen actually as highly problematic. This is the Corviale, for example. We wanted to see if by recontextualizing some of these megaforms, we could sort of recuperate this as a type. And I have to admit to being also, there's a kind of homage here. My favorite project of the original 1978 Roma Inter Rota was James Sterling's entry. And Sterling, I think, again, recognizing the rhetorical nature of the original 78 exhibition, collaged every project they had done to date into his scheme. But, you know, it made a surprisingly convincing proposition. So we wanted to work from that, again, sort of playful response. I sat down with the students doing this next issue of lunch. There's a bit of architectural mischief for you that on Sterling's part, and so we wanted to take a similar kind of light approach. So we cataloged all of the megaforms that exist already in the Roman periphery, and then we cataloged a number of set pieces that we could borrow, and we inserted those into the plan. So producing these series of axonometrics where you see these very large-scale elements that are inserted into the voids of the Roman fabric around the periphery. And then finally, again, thinking back to the films of Pasolini, we realized that the axonometrics and the plans didn't really give us enough of the feel of the sort of life of the place. And so the last thing we did was to produce these series of sort of cinematic montages of these moments of the megaforms collaged into the periphery of the city. And ending with this, which quotes the Pasolini film. So this is an interesting project because in a way, the first section sort of brackets from the very earliest part of my career to something quite recent, and if you will, a project that is after my fairly long-standing engagement with questions of landscape and urbanism that Ayla also mentioned. So I want to talk about this a little bit, and maybe from my own perspective. As Ayla mentioned, I worked with Jim Corner from '99 till about 2003. The first project we did was the Downsview competition. So this is shortly after the term landscape urbanism had been coined by Jim Corner and Charles Waldheim in 1978, when the working principles of landscape urbanism were still, I would say, a little bit fluid. They have subsequently, I mean, landscape urbanism is an interesting phenomenon because it began as a kind of speculative design process, worked out through competitions and exhibitions and conferences, and extensively theorized in writings and conferences and so on, before there was actually an active thing called landscape urbanism as a viable concern in practice. Although I would say that from the beginning, landscape urbanism was strategically oriented towards practice, so it was never purely a theoretical proposition. And I'm, of course, very aware that I'm speaking at a school which has a very sophisticated landscape program. But in my view, landscape urbanism was responding in a way to this dilemma, that for Olmsted, his interventions were absolutely fundamental in defining the character of the cities that he worked in. So landscape had a deeply structural agency in the 19th century cities that Olmsted intervened in. By the late 1980s, and poor Martha Schwartz becomes the kind of scapegoat here, but it's not her fault. Landscape architecture had been reduced to a kind of decorative adjunct to mostly banal corporate or in this case institutional architecture, and I think it was very much in the minds of the early people who thought about landscape urbanism to really recover this larger sense of urban agency for landscape as a practice, and to think about the way that these two images, that the natural landscape, the so-called natural landscape, and the urban landscape are in many ways operating according to the same rules. In both of these images, there's a kind of geometric scaffolding that is set down that steers and directs the growth of the site over time, whether it's the growth of plant species or it's the growth of the city based on the kind of infrastructural networks. I think certainly in the mind of Charles Waldheim, there's something very specific to the dispersed field-like condition of the American city. The idea of an urban landscape that's porous to nature, as you see in the case of a city like Los Angeles, I think was very important in that early thinking. If I had to summarize what are, for me at least, the four important working variables of landscape urbanism, I would say, first of all, is this aspiration to work at a large territorial scale, to see landscape architecture as something that's having a fundamental effect on the structure of the city as opposed to simply filling in the gaps. It's not coincidental that landscape urbanism emerges in the late 1980s at a time when architects, too, were very interested in problems of surfaces and connectivity. So landscape offers architecture and urbanism a model for smooth connectivity. Landscape also offers architecture a very rich model for the relationship between form and program. A more open-ended model, at Columbia in the 1990s with people like Jesse Reiser, we used to talk about the loose fit. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, landscape offers architecture and urbanism a model for change over time. The idea that landscapes and cities are not entities that are fixed in time, but they're always changing, they're always evolving. So I'm going to show one project that belongs to the period of time after I separated off from Jim Corner and was working on my own, and it's the project that Isla mentioned, the Taichung Gateway Park, which was a winning competition for the reuse of the Taichung Metropolitan Airport. Taichung is Taiwan's second city, and as is happening actually in quite a few cities, the airport that was built in the immediate post-war period has been engulfed by the city. A new airport was built further out, and that opened up 240 hectares, that's about 600 acres, of empty, flat land, which was by that time surrounded by urban fabric. Surrounded by rather disjointed urban fabric, but urban fabric nonetheless. However, it was an urban fabric that was completely cut off from the site. So this was a kind of incredible opportunity to work on what was literally a tabula rasa and think about how to invent a new fragment of the city, but also, more importantly, to integrate that fragment of the city into the larger complex of the city around it. So we originally proposed a kind of two-part working framework, a void space, which would be the primary organizing device, and then a kind of infill with fabric. So our original design, there was a need to have a connecting roadway through that actually goes out to the new airport, was simply to take that parkway and sweep it out into a large series of curves, which would then generate green spaces, and then using that as the one sort of fixed piece in the scheme, and then let the city grow in to meet the void. We showed this to the mayor. He said, I promised the people of Taichung a park, and you've given me a road. So we had to pull the road out of the park and rework, but that fundamental principle was still there, that the idea that the void of the park is the organizing device of the scheme. And going back to my working principles, the idea that would give us a kind of flexible working framework that, given the potentially very long horizon of implementation for this project, we didn't really know what was going to happen in Taichung in 15 or 20 years. And so working with the same configuration, we could go much greener. The whole thing could be developed as a park. It could be populated with cultural institutions, or if necessary, it could become more commercial. So that idea of flexibility and change over time was hugely important here. So as I said, this is the final configuration of the park. And of course, Interestingly enough, the built parts of the city are really operating in more conventional urban design terms, with things like FARs and setbacks and zoning codes, because of course we know that as the master plan architects, we weren't going to design that city. We were only going to create the guidelines for that city. And if the city was to really become an authentic part of the urban fabric, it was necessarily going to be produced by multiple authors. So there are, of course, designed green spaces, but there's a lot of work that happened at this level in terms of the analysis of existing patterns and the codification of that for future development. Now, one exception to that sort of two-part schema is this more elaborate architectural piece at the head of the project. Programmatically, it included a conference center, hotels, and a transportation interchange, and a small stadium. And here, I think, for us, this was a very important piece of the project, where architecture was more strongly involved as the sort of protagonist, rather than simply the void space of the city or the kind of codification of urban design norms. So the potential of large-scale architectural interventions to define the logic of the city at this particular moment. Now, this is an aerial photograph. That project was turned into the city in, I don't know, 2010 or 2011. So 5 years later, it is being implemented, and it's rather astonishing to see the traces of our plan registered in a satellite photograph. On the other hand, this is 5 years, and that's all there is. So there's also a certain frustration involved with the very long horizons of implementation here. And in fact, we're actually not involved anymore in the implementation. But we did have the opportunity to do something very quick and rather small on site. We, in fact, convinced the mayor that because the implementation process was going to be so long, let's build something quick and small. So we were given the commission to design a kind of information box where all of the materials documenting the project could be displayed, and also give people an opportunity to get up and sort of watch the process of construction on the site. And this is one of our first sketches. That freestanding building turned out to be way too expensive, and it was one of those nice moments when the budget restrictions force you into something more interesting. Of course, it's an abandoned airport. There was a hangar that we could appropriate on site. And the floor slab of the hangar had been designed to accommodate jet aircraft, so it was very robust. And the enclosure kept the weather out, so gave us a certain amount of freedom. So we proposed to build a temporary pavilion using the traditional bamboo scaffolding that is so ubiquitous in Asia. We also wanted in some way to register the temporary condition of the building in the material itself, which also, by the way, was completely recyclable and reusable after the fact. So the idea that we would create a kind of dense bamboo forest and then carve out public spaces of occupation inside of that. Now, a confession, it turned out that the building codes wouldn't let us do public occupancy with only bamboo structure, even though, in fact, bamboo is incredibly strong and resilient. So, in fact, there is a steel structure, and then, as you can see here, this is the absolutely conventional 50 centimeter by 50 centimeter by 50 centimeter scaffolding technique that's used in skyscrapers all over Asia, anywhere from 150 to 3 meters deep, wrapping the steel skeleton. So there you can see the kind of density of the bamboo and then the skin that we applied around the outside of that. So here is the structure within the hangar. With kind of funny set of working drawings, and little details like we told them to trim the edges. It's much nicer if since they just left them to overlap. So you can see large space at the ground floor, and then a big auditorium. And all of the details are really meant to underscore the temporary quality of the structure. So everything very light and very much to create these juxtapositions with the existing hangar and the lightweight construction. So you see the way it kind of dissolves up into the roof there. This is one of my favorite photographs of the pavilion. Where it allows a certain kind of intimacy, even though it has quite a large scale. You can see the scale as these kids are getting back on their bus. And then one sort of minor coda, shortly after this, we were invited to the Chengdu Biennial, and we created another small bamboo pavilion. But one of the things with these pavilions at biennials that always kinds of bothers me is that they're never occupied. So we wanted this one to be occupied. We proposed it as an aviary, and at least it had some birds living in the pavilion for the duration of the biennial. So now, exactly the same time period as we're working through the Taichung project, I started. I wouldn't necessarily describe it as being critical of landscape urbanism, but asking myself as an architect, what would be the next logical step from landscape urbanism? So this was a conference that, as you can see, took place at Princeton in 2009, and then 2 years later, the book Landform Building came out. So landform building, I would say, tried to do a number of things. On the one hand, it wanted to ask the question, what were the lessons of landscape urbanism that could work in a more specifically architectural context? Obviously the book has two words in the title, form and building, that are very much speak to the agency of architecture. We wanted to take account of a phenomenon that we saw in the profession, many different architects working with landform, but also to be kind of critical of that and say, are there different ways to think about this phenomenon and this interplay between architecture and landscape? And of course, the sort of, again, deeply historical images, like this archetypal urge to create a kind of artificial mountain. It's a photograph of Machu Picchu where I was about 10 days ago. And of course, Machu Picchu is a bit of a cliched tourist site, but it really is truly extraordinary the way that there is absolutely no distinction between constructed ground and what we would normally call architecture. So all of these reflections, and I think the examples where architecture is behaving like landscape, but not necessarily imitating the forms of landscape. Libra's Villa Malaparte in Capri, for example, Gottfried Bohm. Also, this reflection about the fundamentally mineral or geological character of architecture, but also to say that geology is formed by change over time as well. That the biological and the geological in architecture are both products of change and evolution. They're just operating at very different time scales. So the Landform Building book proposed 4 different categories in this attempt to kind of open up the category of landform building beyond what I like to call the softly rounded mound strategy, and looking at a wider range. So again, this is a kind of curatorial, editorial project that in turn informs my practice. So I wanted to show this project in that context because it's an urban project that I think is working with concepts from landscape, but not by neither imitating the forms of nature nor by introducing specifically green elements in, but really thinking about landscape as a kind of spatial and organizational concept. Now, this has an interesting story. We were invited, I worked with Rafi Siegel on this project. We were invited by the New York City Department of Buildings and the Architectural League of New York to look at the housing codes in New York City. And unusually, the architects, there's 6 teams of architects invited, we were specifically requested to break the codes. In other words, find those moments in the zoning and the housing code and the building code that were out of sync with the way that people actually live in the city in the 21st century, make propositions that could then potentially be integrated in and changes introduced into the building codes that would make the housing production in the city more flexible. So we thought about the enormous numbers of office buildings from the 1960s and 70s that are now actually coming up on a kind of 50-year anniversary of their construction. And in many cases, although the structure tends to be sound, the building envelopes are obsolete. They don't meet current energy standards. And in many cases, the floor plates are actually too small for present-day office uses. So we thought this could become a kind of prototype project for the reuse of large numbers of office buildings from the 60s and 70s into a new form of kind of mixed-use housing and commercial and office space. So this happens to be a building designed by SOM. It's on 3rd Avenue in the 50s, but it's chosen more for its typical character than for anything specifically, and there's a view of our project. Now, the ambition of the project was to take all the complexity that's normally found within the horizontality of a Manhattan block and rotate it up and have a similar degree of variation in a vertical project. And one of the ways to do that was to carve a vertical landscape through the building. We didn't really imagine that anyone would actually walk up 40 or 50 stories, but certainly that this could be used locally and would create different social effects through the building as you move up. So this is the actual building skin, reduced to the structure, carving out the voids. There's the pattern of the voids. And again, we wanted to reduce the building to a series of geological strata that were then carved and reoccupied. That's the model in sight. The coding of all the different programmatic activities, the model again, and then a detail of the carving through the building. Now, what you see here is the product of the fact that because office buildings tended to have 12 to 13 foot floor to floor, within 2 floors of office space, we could get 3 floors of residential. So this is the kind of developed version of inserting a new form of living into the shell of the office building and the kind of remnant of those stratified floors. And then here you see the big space carved out and the kind of variations that could happen as the pattern is repeated and developed over the height of the building. And then here, the way it's inserted back into the fabric of the city. So we very much wanted this building to feel like part of the fabric of the city, but to be internally differentiated in a way that this is a residential building, this is an office building, and we wanted to have both of those at work in that building. Now, that thinking is also carried through in a project which was actually was exhibited in Los Angeles until this last month. But originally, we were one of 12 architects in the American Pavilion at the Venice Biennale last year. And the curator's premise, Monica Postiglione and Cynthia Davison, was that they would exhibit as much process as final product. That the title, the Architectural Imagination, was meant to foreground the ways in which architects work and think as much as the projects themselves. There were 4 sites in Detroit and 3 architects working on each site, and I'm very happy to see an Albert Kahn exhibition out in the hallway because we feel we were very fortunate to be assigned to the site of Kahn's Packard plant. So, but necessarily, I think when working in Detroit, you have to start from the conditions of present-day Detroit, and the loss of the kind of urban vitality that characterized Detroit. Detroit, until the 1960s, was one of the primary economic engines of the city. And in this photograph from the early part of the century, not only do you have a fairly coherent sense of the sort of urban fabric of the city, you have streetcars, you have horse-drawn carriages. Actually, automobiles are the least prominent. There are 1 or 2. They're the least prominent. But of course, Detroit has been completely reorganized around the automobile, and this more than that is the reality of contemporary Detroit. The flight to the suburbs, the creation of a city, a dispersed city based entirely on the automobile, and the consequence of what that's done to the city of Detroit, I think everyone is familiar with, the kind of emptying out of the city, and then the emergence on a kind of spontaneous local way of a kind of recuperation of the landscape by local groups at the scale of sort of urban farming and so on. So, and then this incredible architectural artifact that we were given, the Packard plant. First building was built in 1919. Albert Kahn, in collaboration with his brother, who was an engineer, together they patented the Kahn bar system. One of the reasons the Packard plant is still standing is because it's so robustly built, it'd be too expensive to tear it down. So I think a large part of our project was based on the notion of really emphasizing the elemental character of this incredible piece of architecture, almost like a piece of infrastructure, but also situating it in this kind of larger urban field, and recognizing that it's highly unlikely, given the political and the economic situation, particularly today, that Detroit is beginning to recover economically. The downtown is actually coming back in a small way. But if there is a hope for Detroit, it would be in the selective repopulation of highly dense local pockets based on this idea of a kind of archipelago urbanism. In fact, Maurice Cox, who until very recently was the head of city planning, was proposing this as a strategy for the repopulation of Detroit. And we thought that the Packard plant would be the ideal node to anchor a city within a city. And partly this was also based on a recognition that the conventional urban design strategies of local connectivity through walking or bicycling or so on were meaningless at the scale of the Packard plan, and also given the emptiness of the neighborhoods around it. That what we really had to do was to reach out past the boundaries of the site, capture some of the populations that we could then bring to these various other islands within the city. It's an interesting fact that we discovered in our research, that, of course, Detroit is known for the racial problems, the urban poverty, and so on. But the larger metropolitan area in Detroit is actually the 5th wealthiest in the country. So there's a lot of wealth, and there are obviously very good reasons for, not good reasons, there are clear reasons why that is the case. But we wanted to see if we could capture some of that wealth from the suburbs and pull it back into the city. So we were also fascinated by this sort of large scale of these sort of self-sufficient, inward-looking cities, and the idea that the Packard plant could be treated as a kind of urban platform that would anchor this new city within a city. So now the architecture itself is extraordinary. It's the product of 50 or 60 years of development, consistently building with a similar pattern. And you see this very familiar pattern of the thin fingers. This is the status of the site today. And, you know, again, the kind of extraordinary, robust quality of the architecture itself, juxtaposed, of course, with the sense of decay and ruin. But it is the architecture that has actually persisted over time, and that's what we wanted to put at the center of our project. So counterintuitively, in a city that already has too much space, and on a site with 20 million square feet of space, our first move was to make more space. So instead of the thin daylight factory and the finger plan, we wanted to create larger platforms with a deep section which would allow for a flexible programming. So from this pattern here with the streets and the corridors to a continuous infrastructural platforms. So from the fingers to a kind of matte building organization, but then a matte building that's internally porous as opposed to the more partitioned porosity of this. And that's the roof plan of the proposed site. So we're not thinking of this as a building. We're thinking of this as a fragment of the city, and a large portion of the design work is in simply creating new series of platforms and servicing those platforms with a series of circulation and distribution networks. Now, we were fascinated by this photograph and also the kind of poignancy of it, the serial production of automobiles produced in the factory, arrayed in front of the factory building, and we wanted to turn that around. So we produced a very extensive catalog of architectural elements of different scales, which in the model are arrayed in front of the model, and all of these get arranged on those infrastructural platforms. And there is no fixed schema for all of that. What happened was one of a number of possible schemas. So here you see the different scales of elements and a detail there, and the plan of the array of elements on those surfaces. But this was done, I mean, literally the design process in a way recapitulated what we would hope would happen in reality, that the 3 or 4 people working on the model simply placed the elements until they reached a certain density. But as I said, what's in the model is not definitive. It's one of many, hopefully, possible configurations that the project could take. So this is very much about the part-to-part relationships and creating a kind of local texture and inhabiting it over time. But we also recognized that in order for the project to be successful, it needed a more of an identity. In other words, it couldn't be totally self-organizing and incrementally built up. It had to have something that gave it an identity and a kind of institutional presence. So again, working from the notion that these platforms could support a number of different programmatic directions, we proposed that this kind of anchor program would be a new botanical garden for Detroit. So this was a way of relating to that already happening greening of the city, but doing it in a more formal way. And of course, the Botanical Garden for us is a very interesting program because it's a place of leisure and recreation. It's also educational, but it also has a research function. So again, the hypothetical premise here is that you would need some sort of institutional presence here that would be willing to invest money into the site, and that anchor program, so all the green programs, it wouldn't be segregated within the site. It would be kind of woven through the site, and that would serve to give the site a kind of identity and an initial impetus for the growth of all the smaller scale stuff that would happen around it. So this is a kind of key drawing that describes all the moves that we made, the existing buildings on site, the mat building, the infrastructural platforms, the field array, the distribution systems, and then fields, orchards, and gardens, and then finally a series of large-scale insertions that make up together the project. So it's really, as I said, it's an attempt to come close to the complexity of a city that's made up of many different parts from many different authors that very often happen in unexpected and apparently unplanned relationships to one another. That was really our aspiration for the project here. So this is an aviary for the Botanical Garden, next to a formal garden here, next to a kind of research study here, next to an orchard here. So the idea that just as in the city, things are juxtaposed to other things in ways that you wouldn't always expect. And then here, sectional drawing that shows the relationship between the large-scale new interventions and the existing structure. And then here, another view of the model with the array in the foreground. Okay, so the last part is a kind of coda that is really a quick description of some of the other work that's happening in the office aside from this sort of larger scale speculative urban work. And articulates the object side of the equation perhaps more than the field side of the equation. This is the Swedish translation of a field from object to field. And as Isla mentioned, it was originally published in Points and Lines. And I was really fascinated by these configurations that were formed by the repetition of many small agents to create a kind of larger form that you could find in natural examples, but also in certain architectural examples as well. This is Melnikov's Sukharov Market. You see the repetition of this market unit that creates a kind of larger urban assembly. Le Corbusier's Venice Hospital was a very key example. This is a project done around that time. But at the time, in the late 1990s, when this was originally done, I kind of came up against the impasse of the mat building. And that intricate weaving of solid and void. When Alison Smithson, Alison and Peter Smithson down there, in case you didn't know, talks about the characteristic of the matte building as leaving room for the inhabitant to create his or her own space over time. It's a very attractive proposition. Didn't turn out to be so, that's the Free University of Berlin, didn't turn out to be so true in reality. And if there was something missing for me in the matte building and the field conditions ideas, it was this engagement with the iconic form of the building in the landscape and the power of the vertical plane as a kind of architectural element. Again, just simply as a matter of information, that constantly in our practice, we were doing small-scale projects for houses and so on, parallel to these large-scale speculative urban projects. And this is a house we designed in Sagaponack. You can see certain references to traditional roof forms and chimney and so on. And there's a real power to these elements that if you leave it out of your tool case, somehow you're missing a huge opportunity. So I'm going to show this project very, very briefly, because it was very important for me, because for me, it was the first project where I was able to synthesize the sort of part-to-whole ideas from the field conditions with this attention to the sort of iconic form of the building. This is the competition for the new art gallery in Maribor. Maribor, very well-preserved, beautiful historic city, and it's characterized by these steeply sloping tiled roofs. And as we were reading the competition brief, there seemed to be a kind of contradiction in the brief. On the one hand, they wanted a very modern, highly identifiable site for contemporary art. On the other hand, they wanted us to relate to the historic fabric of the city. So our solution was not so much to imitate the historic forms of the city, the roof lines or the street fronts or the cornice heights or anything like that, but to really look at the kind of structural condition and the idea that the historic city is built over time on individual lots according to certain rules, typological rules that create certain similarity, but also allow difference in the expression of individual buildings. So the idea that we could work with a dimension that comes from the historic fabric of the city and juxtapose that and repeat it, and we would therefore be working in a way that was sympathetic with the historic texture of the city without imitating it directly. Now, again, I didn't consciously impose the field conditions ideas on this project, but as we were looking at the problem, it seemed that those sort of part-to-whole relationships were a useful response. This is something I wrote down in a lecture that my friends Emilio Tognon and Luis Benci were giving at Princeton, non-centralized expansive systems capable of becoming specific at any point. That, to me, is a kind of restating of the field conditions ideas. A grid, for example, is a non-centralized expansive system, but a grid is self-similar at any given point. So the idea that you can simultaneously have some sort of unity and wholeness, yet allow local differences and local specificity became a kind of ambition for this project. This is a diagram that a colleague of mine showed to me after seeing the project presented, and it's a diagram of different ways of dividing up species. This is the Linnaean model, where you can see there's a continuous field and there are boundaries drawn within the field. And then this is the archipelago model, where you have separate islands, but they're not touching or interacting. And clearly, these two are the interesting ones, where you can identify the individual island, but it always has a relationship with its neighbor. So that's a very early sketch. So we devised a unit that we could repeat. we experimented with hexagonal plans, but with hexagons, if you pack hexagons, you just get they close pack. The nice thing about the pentagon is it actually doesn't pack very neatly. It leaves voids, which again introduce difference into the system. So that pentagonal unit is repeated 15 times. It gives us this kind of porous mat, but it also gives us a highly expressive roof line, which relates back to the urban fabric in Maribor. And then there's a kind of lattice. The whole thing is lifted up, and that structural lattice, again, is both individuated, but also comes together as a whole. So this is the project in context, and I think you see the way in which the roof line recalls the historic roof lines, but it doesn't duplicate them specifically. And then, as I mentioned, the measurement of the unit is exactly based on traditional lot sizes in Maribor. So just going to run through these then quickly. The details of the gallery and the program. So I want to finish up sooner. So we didn't win that competition. We were not happy about that. But shortly after that, we got the commission interesting commission to add on to a house that I built in 1999 here on the left. So we decided we would build one of the Maribor modules. So basically, it's a studio working studio for an artist, and it actually works well functionally. It was not simply a kind of game of building a piece of an unrealized competition project. So this is the house from 99, very horizontal. And we wanted to create a vertical counterpoint to the horizontal house. And then we also had the opportunity of reworking the landscape around the house. So this is the existing house here and the new addition here. The pentagon in plan, in this case, I like to think of the pentagon as the least complicated form beyond the square that breaks the stability of the square without adding additional complication. This is her painting wall, and the fact that that's opened up from, let's say, a more traditional square form actually makes for a better studio. Here you see the pentagon in plan, the tall skylight that grabs the light, the new entry, the upper level, and then here the tall painting wall and the lights that are arrayed on the opposite part of the roof, the materiality and the connection back to the landscape, all the series of walls that frame the new house, and the studio and the kind of profile, the old house in relationship to the new. So this has become a kind of working thematic in our office. These are German teaching models of crystals, and this is about 2 or 3 months production of study models in the office. And I think one of the things that's important to say is that these models some of them are for very small projects, and some of them are for larger projects. And again, I think that play of similar formal vocabulary, different scales is something. I'm not going to show this project in detail, but it's another museum project where basically the galleries are in the rectilinear parts, skylit, and then all the public spaces of the museum in the more figural form. So that's now functioning at these two different levels. So I'm just going to close by showing a series of smaller scale projects, either built or in construction. Some very, very modest. This is another studio for an artist. All of these are happening, most of them are happening in the Hudson River Valley, so it's also an attempt to come to terms with the nature of that place and the local vernaculars. It's another studio project, And the premise here is it's another variation on the pentagon in plan. I've said it's become a bit of an obsession with me. I realized that this little Monopoly house form is a five-sided figure. So the project is it repeats that figure in plan as well as in elevation. So simple spiral form where you come in, up the stairs, and then a kind of working loft up above, which is this space. Sits on the edge of a hill, looks down, and that was very much an important point of reference for our project in the Chicago Biennial, which is up through January, I believe, where we wanted to make the balloon frame construction really explicit in the project. The balloon frame is a Chicago invention, 1830, and it employs two important technological innovations, pre-cut dimensional lumber and machine-made nails. And balloon frames could be built by relatively unskilled workers and built very, very, very quickly. As a consequence, Chicago becomes we think of Chicago in terms of meat packing and grain shipping, but in the 19th century, from 1830 until the fire in 1870, Chicago was the major center for lumber distribution and production in the United States, and all as a result of the Chicago frame. And this had two really important territorial ecological consequences. On the one hand, balloon frame houses could be put on rail cars and shipped out to the Great Plains, so they were fundamental in opening up the Great Plains for wheat production, which was then, of course, shipped back to Chicago and sent across the Great Lakes to Buffalo. But also the forests of Wisconsin and northern Michigan were decimated to provide this lumber. So it's a really interesting case study of an architectural and building technology innovation rippling out to have all of these effects that are both urbanistic and ecological. So we wanted to make that thematic for our project. So we started with this familiar form that we've been working with and started aggregating it in a way that's similar to the Maribor project, and then created this large-scale model of these 7 units. So the idea is that this could become a sort of a more collective program rather than the sort of individual program. So again, this sort of question of sort of aggregation, part and whole, played a really important role in this project. So that's a rather bad installation photograph. And the montage on the left is, again, a very Chicago-specific reference. I don't know if, how many of you are familiar with this rather remarkable project from the 1970s by Stanley Tigerman, the Black Barn. So we wanted to make a kind of homage to Stanley Tigerman's Black Barn. And so when we collaged the project into this Great Plains landscape with the black, the sort of light-absorbing character of Stanley Tigerman's Black Barn. Another exhibition project. I'm going to go through I promised I'd go through these quickly. There's just a few more. This is an exhibition at New York Institute of Technology. And sometime before this, we had developed a series of house prototypes for a client, and we were particularly interested in this one. Nothing came of that project, so we took the exhibition as an opportunity to build that project. So it's a 1 to 4, somewhere between a construction and a model. And the scalar ambiguity was something that was very, very important to us. but also this game of using the sort of archetypal house form, but combining and repeating it and trimming it so that it's recognizable, yet it's absorbed into the whole. So that's the installation at New York Institute of Technology with the full-scale construction. You see how it kind of crowds the gallery. It's too big for the space in a way, and then just simply photographs of the built work around the outside. And then it was reconstructed in a field, so it really is an object in a field. And you can see the different effects of the translucency of the skin, again, the thematizing of the balloon frame construction, but the nature of the translucent skin gives it, again, this kind of sort of ghostly quality where you're really not sure about the materiality of it. And of course, the scalar ambiguity. It's too small to be a house and too big to be a model. So it has this condition of the folly in the field. And then finally, two projects that are under construction. I'm not going to show in any detail at all, but I think you see the formal similarity of the working with the combinations of this archetypal house form. In this case, a sloping site, so retaining walls that are simply the foundation walls brought up above the site, and then these forms dropped down on top of that. So that's the materiality of just the simple exposed concrete board, and corrugated metal. It's an artist's studio, just a big open working space with a work yard and tall ceilings and clean white walls. That's foundation is poured and framing is started on that. Last project I'm going to show is, I didn't design this house, I wish I had. Some art collector friends of mine own this house, and they asked me to make an addition to this house. And this was an interesting problem to add on to this quirky house, strange mixture of Aldo Rossi, John Haydick. They did have an architect. It was the artist who originally built the house himself. He had a friend of his draw up the plans, and we have never discovered who that architect is. But in this case, you know, we looked at a lot of variations where we would work with a kind of very active profile. And we realized after a while that the existing house had enough figural energy to spare, and that really what we needed to do was make something very quiet and very simple that would highlight the strange figural character of the existing house. So that's the ground floor plan, where we just create a very large open space and a long 35-foot wall for their art collection. It was a bit of a piece of surgery, because we had to remove a lot of columns and insert steel beams to get that sort of open space. And then upstairs, very simple gallery for the display of their collection and a bedroom. The exterior skin is finished, interior work is ongoing. And here you see it in relationship to the existing structure here. And again, the kind of muteness of this in relationship to the active figural character of that. So in a way, I intentionally wanted to close with this smaller scale work as a way of really reiterating the point I made right at the beginning, which is the necessity for an architect to work at different scales and different time scales as well as spatial scales, as a way of thinking about this thematic that I hope runs through both the urban scale work and the smaller scale work of creating a kind of empty framework that then is completed by the inhabitation of the site later in time. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions.
Open it up for questions.
Yes. Yeah, that's an interesting question, and probably an accurate observation that, I mean, on one of those drawings, we do map out the number of functions that were happening on the ground floor, many of which were intended to be larger scale public spaces. We were really trying to make the floor of the city sort of continuous and almost let it run right under the project. Again, there's very little residential fabric around the Packard plant. I mean, again, 50 years ago there was, but today there's hardly any. There's also immediately adjacent, there's a cemetery, which is very bizarre. But yeah, the short answer is we wanted to try and let the city just run sort of right through and under the project. And, excuse me, the ceilings are very tall to begin with. So it's a little bit that idea of treating it almost as a piece of infrastructure. So a little bit like the way the city might run under a bridge or a viaduct. And then we also, we removed quite a bit of what would be the second floor in order to create higher spaces to have that continuity. But it's a good question because it's not obvious from the drawings. Yeah.
So I'm just interested, you said you hope you retain what you would call thematic. Why do you want to kind of observe that thematic in all of the work?
That's a good question. I suppose there's always this desire to maintain a certain level of consistency. I think architecture is a very interesting discipline. You think about poets or novelists or painters, they create their own thematic. A poet decides that he or she, or a painter decides that he or she is going to make a certain kind of work. As architects, we're always at the mercy of commissions or competitions. In other words, we're always responding to something from the outside. So I think architects need some kind of core that they're going to hang on to if you're not just simply going to be pulled one direction and another, this competition, that commission for a house, whatever. So I think that I think there is a certain obligation to an architect to find some kind of common thematic, because otherwise it's just too easy to be pulled in one direction and then the other. Yeah.
Just to follow up on that last comment, that the core of an architect as a theme, do you see that being spatial, material, or political, or what kind of nature is that core? Mm. Is there any, is there many types of architects that have different types of cores? Sure. Just to make.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, to be clear, I mean, because I think the more sort of degraded notion of that is a sort of stylistic signature, and that doesn't interest me at all, right? I mean, the idea that there's some, I mean, I think, I think some sort of formal consistency is not a bad thing, but again, I don't, the world itself is a weird, complex, and inconsistent place, and I don't think you can impose your ideas on that reality. So for me, the way that, in the most sort of positive way, the way that consistency or that sort of core could come to the foreground is I don't know, in consistently asking the same questions and having a series of having a set of strategies to respond to reality. But I mean, I suppose the flip side of the previous answer I gave is that I think you do have to respect, you have to respect the basic heterogeneity of reality. And you can't impose a kind of consistent formal language or a consistent approach on projects that are different. So I think for me it's more a kind of I don't know, a kind of conceptual consistency in the way that you approach things and work with things. And yeah, I'm not sure I would say it's political, but I would say it's a question of values in terms of this idea that the architect has to, whether it's a very small scale project like an art gallery or a very large scale project like an urban site, that the architect has to leave room for the users, the public, the collective, to impose their will on it as opposed to imposing his or her will on it. We can always pick it up later. Okay, thank you.